Hi Charm Scouts, and welcome to a new month on Patreon. I am so excited to be bringing you this month's pattern, the Cobbler Dress and Set. So you can see the one I'm wearing. This is the dress version, and this was inspired by 40s pinafore dresses. Think Judy Garland, Wizard of Oz, shoulder ruffle moment, okay? But then the other inspiration was 50s cobbler apron sets. So that would be like these two versions on the mannequin behind me. You have your hip length version, so we do have a line indicated on the pattern where you can make a top instead of a dress. And as you can see, it's cinched in the back with a cute little bow. And then these versions have a capri pant to go with them. And I'm so excited about this pant because it's like your secret pajama with the flat front and then an elastic waist back. So there's a lot to love about this pattern. It's great for lounging, great for housework, and you can also dress it up in a different fabric to wear to work or something like that. So a few things about what we're doing this month. This month's merit badge is in bias binding. And this is the perfect project for it because as you can see, highlighted by the striped fabric here, we have a neckline binding and we have an armhole binding as well. And so I'm going to show you how to make these perfectly neat, lovely bindings. And I'm also going to talk about the bias in general. So things like, how do we get this effect on the pocket here by creating a bias grain line where it isn't necessarily indicated on the pattern, right? So we'll talk about that, all about the bias this month. We also have a fun bonus project for you that's going to be free on the Charm blog, which is a matching oven mitt. I'm so excited about this. This was very common to patterns in the 50s to have like your cobbler set for your housework, and then you would have a matching pot holder or oven mitt or something like that. You guys know I don't cook, so I probably won't be using this, but you can use it, and it's so adorable to pair them together. Think very Claire McCardle, popover dress, that kind of fantasy. So we're gonna get right into it, and I hope you love this design. I feel like it's very reminiscent of our popover dress from a couple years ago, which I know you all loved. So think of this as just a pop it on, cinch it with the tie. So comfy, so casual, but a million different ways to make it. So let's get started. Okay, so let's talk about the pattern pieces and how they go together. So as usual, we've printed out some little doll size pieces for you so that we can get a sense of the overall pattern. So you did the Mariner top last month, so now you know all about shoulder princess seams, and we're revisiting them this month with a shoulder princess seam in the front. This is your dress slash top center front. You can see there is a hip length cutting line if you want to make the top version, so you just cut the pattern there. This is your center front. You've got your side front. Now there are two side fronts included in the pattern. One is for cup sizes A through double D, and then there is a second grouping for F through H cups. So just keep an eye on that, and you only need to print and cut whichever cup size you are making. So today I am making the A through double D. I've got my center front. You've got your center back of the dress all in one piece, no princess seam on the back, cut on the fold. If you want to make the ruffle, and of course you need to make the ruffle at some point, here is the piece right there. We also have a pocket for you, of course. We would not let you down. This is a great little pocket with a lot of room. You can see it goes on the side piece like this, the side front. And interesting thing about this pocket, you can see how it looks bigger than the piece that it's going to be connected to. And the reason for that is that we always put a little bit of ease at the top of our pockets so that you can fit your phone in them or your hand in them, your snacks in them, whatever you're putting in your pockets, you want to have a little bit of ease right there. So that's going to go together like this and then create that excess at the top that lets you use your pockets. So what else do we have? A lot of rectangular pieces in this pattern. You have got your armhole binding, your neckline binding, nice long skinny piece, and we're going to be talking about bias in a couple chapters. Your sash pieces, which get inserted into the front princess seam and then tied in the back. And let's talk very briefly about the pants. The thing I love about these pants is that they really don't have a lot of pattern pieces. You've got your pant front, your pant back. You can see the back is bigger because it has an elastic waist that has to be gathered in. The front has a dart for shaping. You have your adorable little cuff with the tie if you're going to be using that. You can also choose to omit that and just do a little slit at the bottom if you prefer. And then you have your two waistband pieces. So this is the front waistband, which you also need to cut in interfacing. Fun fact, this is the only piece that you cut in interfacing in this entire pattern, so that's a little different for us. And then this is your back waistband, and that one you don't want to cut interfacing for because it's going to be gathered, so you don't want a lot of stiffness and bulkiness there. Okay, so if you have any questions, you can always refer back to the cutting layouts and the piece guide, which tells you if you're going to cut interfacing or not and how many of each piece you need to cut. All right, so that's it. Pretty simple pattern, and even though it has a lot of options, it's not the sort of choose your own adventure madness that we did last month with the Mariner top. So very straightforward, and let's get started talking about supplies. Okay, let's talk fabric and supplies. So mercifully simple this month. You don't need a lot of supplies. You need your fabric. For this pattern, I just love cottons and like cheerful prints, florals, novelty prints. Great excuse to bust into your stash and break out some of that stuff you've been saving. So I am going to be using today this cotton poplin. This is from my new collection at Spotlight, coming out actually this month. So look at me being timely. Spotlight is available in Australia and New Zealand, but I know you guys do little trades on the sew and tell and everything. So there is a black market if you love this fabric. Okay, so this is a poplin, has just a little bit of body crispness to it. You could also use things like lawn, something a little drapier, softer cottons, even quilting cotton would work great for this dress. Just think something that's, low care, fun, and simple. Now let's talk about the pants. You can make some different choices on the pant. You could do something with a little bit more body, like I'm going to be using a lightweight denim today with this really fun engineer stripe on it. You don't want to go too heavy, I will warn you, on the pant. So if you're thinking of like a heavy denim, just don't, because on the back waistband, there is that elastic gathering, so that can get very bulky. So if you're not sure, just kind of test it out with your hands and see how it reacts to gathering. Okay, so you could also look at other fibers, not just cotton. You could think about linen blends, maybe a nice silk, like a raw silk or something like that. So yeah, I would say just play around with it and see how it drapes, but there are a lot of options. All right. And then for the pant, you are going to need interfacing for the front waistband only. So not a lot of interfacing used this month, but for my lightweight denim, I'm going to pair it with a weft fusible interfacing. So make sure you have that on hand. You need thread to match your fabric. And then if you're making the pant, you are going to need some elastic for the back waistband. So it needs to be 3/4 of an inch wide. And I am using this non-roll elastic, but you can also just use the plain knitted elastic that you can find at your local store. I would say it doesn't really matter that much, but the width does matter. So look at 3/4 of an inch. And that's it for this month. So now let's get into talking about bias and bias binding. Okay, let's talk about bias and bias binding. So this is your little educational journey for the month to earn your merit badge. I really wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about what is the bias grain, why do we use it for binding, and how do we use it for binding. So just to illustrate, I have this piece of striped denim right here. You can see the selvage over here. So you would normally cut a pattern piece on the straight grain, either parallel to the selvage, or you would turn around and do the crosswise grain, right? So like an X, like that. Now the bias grain goes at a 45-degree angle to the selvage, like that. So you get the stripes on the diagonal, which is a really fun way to play with stripes is to use the bias, and why we did one of our samples this month with the bias striped binding. So now that you understand the different grain lines, why do we use bias for binding? The reason is that the bias grain line is very malleable and it curves easily. So for a neckline like our cobbler dress, see we have a pretty sharp curve there, you can take a piece of bias and see how it stretches a little bit. You don't want to like go crazy stretching it out because it will stretch out and not necessarily bounce back depending on the type of fabric. But what we can do is sew it on and it will curve around, and then we can flip it in to create a nice neat edge. Now I always like to provide you with the bias binding pieces so that you know the exact length you need. No muss, no fuss. But in vintage patterns, it would also often tell you something like just cut strips of bias and apply, you know? So we like to be really prescriptive about it and give you the pattern piece to cut it exactly to length and the width you need. And that's the way that we're going to be applying the bias binding today, by sewing it on flat, turning it in again, and then folding that inside edge in and stitching in the ditch to apply it. Okay, so that's one way you can do bias binding, is with those flat strips. The other way you can do bias binding, and probably the way that's more familiar to beginners, is to buy pre-packaged, pre-folded bias binding. This is called a double fold bias binding. See how it turns in here and then it turns in again. And in this case, the work is already done for you. You just enclose the raw edge, just kind of sandwich it on there, and then stitch it. So if you like that idea, if that's appealing to you, you can certainly use prepackaged binding for this. You can also create your own folded binding by using a bias tape maker. I'm not going to get too much into this today because there are a million YouTube videos showing you how to do this, but you essentially feed a bias strip into it and it creates the fold by ironing it. I find them a little fussy. I personally like to just cut my strip and apply it flat, and that's what we're going to show you today. Now, I did want to give you one more little tip about bias and cutting bias pieces, which is, let's say you have a piece that's not cut on the bias per your pattern instructions, like the pocket, which is what I'm showing you here, okay? You can see on the black and white version that we did this month that we did cut the pockets on the bias to get that sort of chevron pointing in effect of the stripes. And we did that by turning this piece on the bias. So how do you find the bias grain line if it's not provided on your pattern piece? It's really simple. See that your straight grain line is right there. Now we can create a bias grain line by taking a clear gridded ruler, and you want to find a square on your ruler. So let's say you could find a 2-inch square like this, all right? And what you're going to do is align the top of the square with one end of your straight grain line and the bottom of the square with the other end of your grain line, like that. So it's perfectly aligned within the square on the grid. Then you just draw a new line like that, okay? And that would be your bias grain line. And if you want to cut a stripe on the bias, you can just align the bias grain line with one of your stripes on your fabric like this. See, I chose a stripe and aligned it like that. And now your stripes will be facing inward on your pocket. And then you would turn the other piece over. It's kind of good to cut these things separately, so one at a time on the flat, single layer. Cut the other one the other way so that then they meet. The bias grain is like going towards the center of your cobbler apron, and it's a really cute effect. So really fun to play with stripes, and that's how you would change a straight grain line to a bias grain line. Okay, so let's talk first steps. So here you can see I have laid out my dress front pieces. I have my center front, which was cut on the fold. I went ahead and did the first step in the instructions, which was stay stitching from the shoulder all the way down to the bottom princess seam notch. So a line of stay stitching at about 1/2 inch seam allowance. Here are my side front pieces, which are going to get seamed together here, just like the Mariner top. But the cool thing about the cobbler dress and the cobbler top is that it has a lot of things, not a lot of things, but the princess seams are an opportunity to insert things like our sash tie, which will get inserted here, and then also the ruffle gets sewn into the princess seam. So really, before we do anything else, we have to work on those things that get inserted into that seam. So if you're doing a ruffle, we are going to start with that. And the ruffles look like this, these real long pieces. They have a sort of angle shape to them. You need to cut 4 of them, by the way, so 2 sets, 1 for each princess seam. And you'll notice that one long side has a notch on it. And you know I don't normally do the triangular cutouts on my notches, but I did in this case just so that I could really see for myself which side is going to get seamed to the front princess panel here. Okay, because that notch is going to match the upper princess seam notch here after it's gathered. So these are going to get inserted into each princess seam. But first we need to sew these ruffles, okay? So what we're going to do is go over to the machine and we're going to sew the ruffles. The upper edge here, we need to seam across that short upper edge and then along the long unnotched side, okay? So as you're stitching, you wanna make sure that you're not stitching the side with the notch, and then you're gonna go all the way down and don't stitch across the shorter end or that opposite long edge with the notch, okay? So you can start by pinning your 2 ruffle pieces right sides together along that short upper edge, and then your long unnotched edge. And then we're going to go to the machine and stitch that. All right, we are ready to sew our ruffles. So I am starting at that upper short end, of the ruffle, and we are going to sew at 5/8 of an inch. And you're going to pivot at this first corner, and then sew all the way down this long unnotched side. I'm going to backstitch there, and now I'm going to repeat that process on my other ruffle. Now, normally, you know, I kind of just do one side and then I go about my merry business and let you finish the other side on your own, and then we come back. But with this garment, it's really important to look at both sides of this ruffle at the same time because they're mirrors of each other. So we're going to be understitching different sides depending on which side you insert it into the princess seam. So let me go ahead and stitch my other ruffle now. Okay, 2 stitched ruffles. Okay, let's go ahead and trim these seam allowances. Now, I'm just going to trim mine evenly rather than grading them. if you were a real stickler for grading, which I normally am, I would say you could sit with this and try to figure out which side to grade, because it's going to be which side to grade longer, because it's going to be different on each side. And that pretty much breaks my brain when I try to figure it out. So we're just going to say that this fabric is thin enough that we're not going to see a ridge, and it's going to be totally fine. So don't worry about grading. Just trim it down. Trim those corners nice and close. And then we're going to do the same thing on the other side. Okay, now let's take a look at these two nicely trimmed ruffles together. So as you can see, one will go on one side of your dress and the other will go on the other side. The next thing we're going to do is understitch. So to understitch your ruffle, you're going to need to open it out and then stitch the side that's going to be the underside of the ruffle. Okay, so just to make, it's going to be different on each side of the ruffle. So to make things easy on yourself, I would lay them both out together like this and visualize which side is going to be the underside when you wear it, right? So if this is going to be my left ruffle, this is going to wrap to the underside, and you want your stitching to not be visible, of course, so we're going to do our understitching on the right side here. And then it's going to be the opposite on the other side. It'll be on the left side as we're looking at it. Okay, so let's start with this one. And there's a corner here, so you're not going to be able to understitch all the way into that tight little corner. So what you're going to do is just put this over your machine like so and get back up as far as you can into that corner. Then put down your presser foot and start understitching as high as you can, but don't stress out about it. There is a tight corner where you're not going to be able to get in there. So I'm stitching on the right side of the seam. I'm making sure my seam allowances are oriented under my needle. And I'm just kind of like holding the seam taut. And we're going to understitch all the way down. Okay, normally I would start pressing this right now because, as you probably know by now, I like to press right after I understitch. But again, I'm going to do things very strategically here, and I'm going to work on the other side first so that I have it all visually straight in my head that I am understitching the correct side. So now I'm going to take this piece and make sure that I'm stitching to the left of the seam line because it goes on the opposite side of the dress. So same exact process, but I'm stitching on the opposite side of the seam line. Okay, so just to review, we now have 2 ruffle pieces sewn together and understitched on the opposite side of the seam line. And now we're going to press. So you can turn those corners right side out and just kind of poke them out gently. Same on both sides. And now we can press. So, as I feel like you've probably heard me say a million times by now, we're going to use the understitching as a pressing aid. And we're just going to roll that understitching to the edge of the piece to get a nice crisp edge, like so. All right, so let's press our entire ruffle for both sides. Okay, so as you can see, we now have two beautifully sewn ruffled pieces, nicely pressed, and our understitching is on the opposite side for each. So they are ready to be gathered and inserted into those princess seams. So when we come back, we'll do that step. All right, so we are now ready to gather our ruffles. So you have these 2 long pieces, and we're going to do 2 rows of gathering stitches along the raw edges. So these are still open, and our first row of gathering stitches will also serve a dual purpose of basting this together too, so it's not open anymore. So let's see, let's start with this one, and we're going to start from the top and do your first row of gathering at 1/2 inch using a long stitch, so 4 to 5 millimeters. And then your second row of gathering will be at 1/4 inch. So 2 rows right next to each other. Got my long stitch going. First one's at 1/2 inch. I'm going to start close to the top and stitch all the way down. And here you can see my layers got a little bit off because of the understitching, because of turn of cloth, right? So one got turned in a little more than the other. And I would not worry about that. I would use the longer one as your guide when you're looking at your throat plate for your seam allowance. And it kind of disappears to nothing down here, which is what you want. And now our second row of gathering will be at 1/4 inch. Start at the top again. Okay, so now we will gather the ruffles. So you can start at either end, and you're going to pull your bobbin threads. And just start gathering them up. And the whole thing from top to bottom will be gathered. So I'm going to get as far as I can on this side, and then I'll probably go to the opposite, to the bottom, and start gathering from there. It's a lot of gathering to do, and if you want a gauge of how much you need to gather it, you can look at your pattern piece for your center front dress, and you'll see that the ruffle ends right above where the waist sash circles are. Okay, so you can kind of lay it over your pattern piece and get a sense of if it's gathered up enough yet or too much. You know, you might have gone crazy and you have so many gathers. All right, so I'm just going to keep gathering like this until the whole thing is a beautiful ruffle. But see how cute that looks? So as you can see, I have a lot of gathers going on here. And what I like to watch out for is if there's any little areas like this where you're like missing gathers or it looks kind of bumpy, you know, it's not quite as uniform as the rest of it, then you can kind of just distribute. You know, I can just kind of check the dress I'm wearing to make sure it's the right length, but you can check your pattern piece. And we can adjust it later too when we go to put it on the pattern. So just kind of get it in the ballpark of the correct length. So there's my adorable little ruffle. I love these so much. So I'm gonna go do the other one, and then we will come back and I'll show you how to place them on your dress center front. All right, so you can see that I have my ruffles all gathered up, and you can kind of see how this is gonna start to go together now. The ruffle is going to be placed right sides together with the center front of the dress. So you need to make sure that your side without the understitching is the one that faces the right side of the dress when you put them together. And you're going to place the top of the ruffle so that it's 5/8 of an inch below the raw edge of the shoulder. And you can just use a ruler to double check your measurement there. And that is because you don't want this to get caught into your seam here, right? This is going to be sort of free right here. So you don't want to catch the top of the ruffle into your shoulder seam. All right, and then we're going to distribute the rest of the ruffle. It ends at the lower notch, okay? So we have one notch here, which matches the notch on the ruffle, if we can find it again, now that it's so gathered. And then the bottom of the ruffle matches the lower notch. And what happens with the notch is that, with the ruffle, is that it just kind of disappears, right? It kind of tapers off into the seam. So now what we're going to do is, if you can find your notch in here, oh, there it is. That matches the other notch on the princess seam, so you can put a pin there. And then you're going to distribute your gathers. See, I'm going to need to pull my gathers up a little bit more because I've got a little bit too much slack on my ruffle above that notch, but it looks good down here. So I'm going to spend some time arranging my gathers, pulling them up, pinning them in place, making sure that my seam allowances are nice and flat. You know, what can happen with ruffles is that they can kind of, well, the seam allowances ruffle up and it gets very annoying. So spend some time with this, you know, really make sure it's nice and flat, pinned in place, and then you're going to go to your machine and baste that ruffle in place with a long stitch using a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Okay, so I'm going to do that on this side, I'm going to repeat on the other side, and then we'll come back and we'll be at the sash step. All right, so you can see that I have basted my ruffles right sides together with my dress front. And after doing this step, I would really recommend that you flip your ruffle out and think about how it's going to look when you wear it. And just make sure that you're happy with how it looks, especially that there's no, you know, the ruffle didn't get twisted or anything down here. No weird, you know, spots with not enough gathers in them, stuff like that. So just take a look at both sides and make sure you're happy with it, but look how cute. So we can leave the ruffles for now, and now we have to do the sash. This dress is so funny because there are so many things you have to do before you can even just sew the seams, and then it comes together really quickly. So the next thing we're gonna do is the sash pieces, which you should have cut 4, and that's this long piece with the angled ends. So you have 2 sets of 2, just like with the ruffles. These are much simpler though. You're going to take each of these pairs and we're going to stitch all the way around 3 ends. So one long side, the short angled end, and then the other long side, pivoting at the short angled end corners. And you can leave it open on the straight short end. Okay, so we're gonna go to the machine and do that, and then we will do the process of turning them right side out and attaching them to the dress. Okay, so I've sewn all 3 sides of one sash, and we are going to trim these seam allowances down to like 1/8 of an inch, 1/4 inch, and trim away any excess from the corners where you pivoted. Okay, so I'm just trimming away a little bit more at my corners. You don't want to trim too close, but remove any excess. And now we're going to turn this right side out. So I have my fast turn tool set. I know Melisha showed you a different one in her bow tutorial last month, and now I'm going to show you my favorite one, which is called the fast turn. It comes with a whole set of tubes in these different sizes, and you just insert the tube into your sash. And then it has the set of wire guys with the little pigtails at the end. You insert that into the tube and twist the pigtail through the end of your sash. You kind of stretch the end over the end of the tube, the end of the sash over the end of the tube, then twist your pigtail through the fabric at the end, and then you just pull it right through, like voila. So I love these things. They're so easy to use. And now you can see it needs a really good press. So, and you also need to deal with the corners at the end, that little angled end. So just use your fingernails and a pin to kind of pull those out. And now you're just going to get this nice and flat. And we're going to press the whole thing. So I'm going to, when you're pressing something like this, like a tube like this, you have to make sure that the seam is rolled all the way out to the edge so that you don't have a fold where it kind of collapses on itself at the edge. So take a little time with this step, which is what I'm going to do right now. I'm going to press this nice and flat. I'm going to repeat all those steps with my second sash tie, and then I'll show you how to place them on your dress. All right, so we have our sash pieces sewn, and now I'm just going to show you how to place them on your dress center front. So you should have 2 pieces like this with the angled ends, and we're going to take the raw edges and they get placed underneath, right sides together, where the ruffle ends, if you did the ruffle. And there are 2 circle marks that I marked in pencil on my wrong side here, and the sash just gets centered between those 2 circle marks. So you can just pin it in place here. And one thing I want you to note is that I position my sash pieces with the tie end angled down like this, okay? So I personally don't think it really matters which way you do it as long as you keep it the same on both sides, right? You wouldn't want one pointing up and the other angled the other way. So make sure you have that same shape when you go to pin to the opposite side under the opposite ruffle. Just checking for those circle marks there, and then I'm going to pin these in place. And now we can just baste these on real quick. So just use a long stitch length, like 4 or so. And we're going to baste within the seam allowance at 1/2 inch. There's one side, and then let's do the other. And there we go. Okay, so we finally have a finished center front piece, but now we have to work on the pockets. So as you can see, this design really takes advantage of the seams. And the next way we're going to do that is by applying the pocket on the dress side fronts, and then the edges of the pocket get caught in the princess seams and the side seams. Okay, so I'm going to walk you through those steps. Let's put the dress front to the side and get your pocket pieces out. And I would really recommend having your pocket pattern piece handy as well, just because there's a lot about this piece that can get confusing, right? We're looking at an early version here. You're going to have your beautiful version with the, your size lines and your logo and all of that, and it will be labeled in something other than my messy handwriting at the top here saying that this is the top of the pattern piece for the pocket. And then also you will have these same circles. So 2 big circles on one side, one vertical edge, and then 2 small circles on the other side. And you should see corresponding circles on the dress side front so that you know which is which side of the pocket, because this pocket piece is very specifically shaped to match the curve of the dress or the top at the bottom. And also, as I mentioned earlier, it has a little excess ease at the top so that you get this kind of effect that it curves outward so you can fit your phone or your hand in it or whatever. So if you accidentally put this on the wrong side, the pieces aren't going to quite match up. So just have your piece handy is all I'm saying. All right, so here is, and you've cut 4 of these, right? So I'm looking at one pair right now, right sides together. And for the dress version, we are going to sew the top, the upper edge of this piece, so what's labeled the top, upper edge, and the bottom edge, okay? Now, note that if you're making the top, if you make the top at some point, which ends at the hip, for that version, you leave the bottom open. You only sew the top. And the reason for that is the bottom edge of the pocket gets caught in the hem on the top. It ends at the bottom of the top, okay? But for the dress, you need to have a nice finished edge down there. All right, so we're going to sew those 2 edges at 5/8 of an inch. Oops, let me switch back to my regular stitch length. Okay, and now we're going to trim down these seam allowances. And we're going to turn this right side out. And if you're making the top, you could understitch the upper edge, but for the dress, I am not going to do that because it's kind of like the ruffle. It gets really confusing which side is which, because it becomes a mirror image. It gets really confusing, and you could potentially have understitching on the right side of your pocket. So it's not super necessary here as long as you really get a nice crisp edge and do that trick we talked about with the sash too, of rolling out the edge of the seam like so. Okay, so there's one pocket, nice and pressed. And I'm going to repeat the same thing with the other side, and then we'll come back and place these on our dress side fronts. All right, so let's talk about pocket placement. So again, let's just look at the pattern pieces together, and hopefully it'll start to make sense how these were drafted. So you can see the small dots on one side of the dress front and the big dots on the other, and then they match each other like so, and then that ease I'm talking about will appear like this at the top of the pattern piece, the pocket. So you need to make sure, and I just spent a little time before we turned the camera on, making sure that your pockets are correctly placed according to the small and large dots, right? Because on the other side, it's going to be opposite like this, and they're not, you can't just, place one on the right side and then place it on the left side, right? You need to be very deliberate about which side it goes on. So what you're going to do is find your circle marks on your pattern, on your dress side front. So I transferred my circle to the right side there, and the pocket finished edge will get placed right below there, and then I have another circle at the bottom. So I'm just going to center my pocket between those two circles on the vertical edge of the piece, all right, and then pin those layers together. Same thing on this side. I have one circle mark right there and another circle mark right here. So I'm going to center the pocket edge. So again, don't worry about that ease right there. That's what it's supposed to look like. And you can also pin along the lower edge because we're going to edge stitch this in place to secure it. All right, so put that to the side, and let's do the opposite side here. It would be really fun to do contrast pockets as well. If you really want to call this out as a design feature, how cute would that be to do a color block version where you can do color blocking with the center panel too, which is really fun. So when I do the crowdcast this month, I can't wait to share with you some of the vintage images I have of cobbler aprons and cobbler sets and show you some fun ideas for how to take it to the next level. Okay, so let's pin the bottom here. All right, so we're going to go to the machine now, and we're going to start by basting the vertical edges, and then we're going to edge stitch the lower edge of the pocket. Okay, so we're ready to baste those vertical edges of the pocket. So I'm going to do a long stitch on my machine and use a 1/2 inch seam allowance. And just basting those raw edges together. And for right now, just leave the bottom edge alone, the bottom edge of the pocket. We're going to baste the other vertical side. All right. And now we need to edge stitch the lower edge of the pocket, right? So just did those two vertical basting lines on the sides, and now we need to worry about this. So I'm going to switch to my edge stitching foot. You guys know I love this foot. Sometimes I don't worry about it, but if it's going to be like a really visible line of stitching, it's nice to have something to help you, right? So I'm going to use my edge stitch foot here, align it with that blade on the edge stitch foot with the bottom of the pocket, and then just change my needle position so it's to the left of the blade. And now I'm going to get a nice uniform line of stitching along the bottom edge of my pocket. But you know what I just did? Left it on a basting stitch. So don't do that. We're going to take that out. Don't be like me. Change your stitch to your regular stitch length. All right, let's try this again. 2.5. I was like feeling so good about myself too with my edge stitch foot. All right, take 2, edge stitching. So we are going to just stitch right along there with our edge stitch foot. And there we go. I don't know why I feel like these pockets are like so fun to sew. So yeah, you can really see it come together here. You've got your edge stitched lower edge of the pocket and then a nice roomy pocket bag right here. So I'm going to repeat that process with the other pocket and then we'll be ready to sew some princess seams finally. Okay. So how fun is this? You can see how the front dress pieces are going to come together now with 2 side pieces with the pockets applied, the front with the optional ruffle, and then your sash pieces. So now we're going to sew this just like you would any other princess seam, like we did for the mariner top. We're going to put these right sides together, but the trick with this one is you want to make sure that everything stays, you know, on the center front piece stays oriented towards center front. So make sure you don't get your sash pieces caught in the seams or anything like that, just where they're basted. All right, so we're going to go right sides together like this and pin. And you know, it's a little tricky on the ruffles too, especially with lighter weight fabrics, because it tends to get a little bunchy here. So just be careful that you're not accidentally getting any little wrinkles when you sew like that. I mean, if you do, it's not the end of the world, just take them out. But just something to be aware of. Another thing to be aware of is princess seams. We talked about last month. You may need to do some clipping to get them to ease together. Now, I've found that for the lower cup sizes, like I said, today I'm doing the A through double D grouping. There's not a huge curve on this princess seam because it's a fairly loose garment. So as you can see, I'm not really needing to clip to spread those curves like we did on the mariner top, but the caveat I want to make is that on the larger cup sizes, you may need to do that clipping and spreading to meet the curve, because for the higher cup sizes, you're going to have more of a curve on your princess seam. So do be aware of that. But other than that, we just need to keep pinning this seam all the way down to the hem. And we're going to go sew both of these princess seams. So I have one side pinned. I'm going to do the same thing with the opposite princess seam, and then we'll go over to the machine. Okay, we are ready to sew our princess seams. So just regular stitch length, and a couple things to be looking out for. You want to make sure that the top of your ruffle, if you do have a ruffle on here, is kind of out of the way. So just kind of like hold it down a little bit. And you're going to catch it in your seam, but it starts at 5/8 of an inch below the raw edge of the shoulder. All right, we're going to start stitching, and another nice long seam. And again, the one thing to be really careful of here is these seam allowances on the bottom where the ruffle, if you do have a ruffle, that it can get a little bunchy and start to kind of like fold in on itself. So I am just using my right hand to kind of make sure that it's smooth underneath there. But again, it's something you can always fix later. Okay, so there is one princess seam sewn, and let's just take a look at it. Make sure we didn't get any weird bunching. Looks good. All right, so let's look from the right side. This step is so satisfying. Look how beautiful our ruffle looks. And you want to check the bottom of the ruffle to make sure that you don't see any seam allowance, any like raw edge exposed at the very bottom there. It should just disappear into the seam like mine is doing. Then you have your sash, your pocket. Look how fun is that? I love this, how this pocket goes together. Okay, so you're going to do your other princess seam, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to finish my seam allowances off camera, and I do mine on the serger, and I'm going to be trimming them down as I serge to about 3/8 of an inch. And then these seams get pressed towards center front. It'll make sense when you do it because the ruffles will only lay flat if you press the seams towards center front. So I'm going to do that. You can also serge just flat, single layer, your vertical edges now if you haven't already, and your shoulder edges so that they're all ready to put together with the back, which is our next step. So I'm going to go ahead and do my other princess seam, do all that serging. I'm going to serge the vertical edges on my back dress piece. And then when we come back, we'll be looking at the pieces coming together into a dress with the shoulder seams and the side seams. All right, so I have sewn and serged and pressed my princess seams. And I did just want to note that when I press the ruffles, after I press the princess seams to center front, then I turn it so that the right side is facing me and just press the ruffles down so they look nice and neat like this. Another thing you can do, I just want to mention, this is in the instructions as an option, is that you can top stitch along this princess seam, at least down to the sash, and that will hold your ruffle in place. I haven't done it on any of my samples just because it's really hard to get a nice looking top stitch when you have so much bulk underneath there, especially when the top layer is so thin. So they're kind of pros and cons either way. If you don't top stitch it, sometimes the ruffles at the bottom kind of start to go this way. So when you wear it, you just kind of have to adjust them as you're wearing it. So just something to be aware of. And let's see what else. So I did my serging on my princess seams, and then side seams, shoulder seams are done. I didn't trim anything off when I was doing it in a single layer, just when I did the princess seams, when I was finishing them as one. And now we're going to take our dress back, which is all one piece, no seams, no darts, nothing. Very simple, because this gets gathered as a sort of blouson effect in the back with the sash. So all you have to do with this is put it right sides together with the front and sew the shoulder seams. And the tricky thing about this is, see how that ruffle is trying to get into your seam right there? You need to make sure that it stays out of the way when you sew this seam, because you don't want it to get caught in there. Okay, so I'm going to pin my shoulder seams, and then my side seams are from, there's a circle mark at the underarm, and you're gonna sew pretty much just from that corner all the way down, okay? See how there's like a really pronounced corner? From the corner down to the hem of your dress, okay? So for just easy straight seams, I'm gonna go ahead and do mine and then press those seam allowances open. And then we're gonna come back and we're gonna start talking about those bias bindings. Okay, everyone, so we are ready to do our neckline binding. So on my dress, I've sewn my shoulder seams, my side seams, pressed them open. I have a real dress here, and now we just need to do our edge finishes. So our neckline binding, armhole binding, and then the hem. So we're so close. And we are going to start with the neckline binding, and I'm really excited to show you this method. I know we've done some bias bindings and bias facings on Patreon projects before, but since our merit badge this month is bias bindings, I think this is a great opportunity to just really delve into how just a strip of bias fabric like this can become a binding without having to use one of those fussy bias makers or anything like that. Okay, so we're just going to take our strip and we're going to put it right sides together at the short ends of the fabric and sew it into a ring this way. So 5/8 of an inch. There we go. I'm going to press this open. Hopefully my iron is on it. It is. Okay, so now you can just isolate that seam allowance and press it open. All right, and the next thing I would recommend that you do is find the sort of halfway point from this seam. So kind of fold this bias binding in half like this, and then find the other halfway point. I'm going to put a pin right there. And now we're going to do the same thing to the neckline. We want to find the center back and the center front point on the neckline. So what I would do is just isolate the neckline like this, put the side seams together, the shoulder seams, sorry. Whew. And then we will fold it to find center back. So you can put a pin there. And then center front. So now we know how to match the binding to the neckline itself. Okay, so here's what we're going to do next. Right sides together, we're going to take the bias binding where we have that short little seam, we're going to match that to center back on the neckline. And now we're going to match the center front pins. Here it is, oops, on the wrong side. Center front to center front, like so. And then we're going to just distribute the excess around the rest of the neckline. And you can put a few pins here and there. You don't need a ton of pins, because you can just kind of almost stretch the bias binding to match the neckline as you're sewing it. Okay, so let's start at center back, and we're going to sew this using a 1/4 inch seam allowance, okay? Very important. Just a 1/4 inch, not your full 5/8 of an inch. And we're going to sew all the way around like this, making sure that those raw edges of the neckline and the bias binding piece are matching exactly. Your seam allowances stay open. Okay, I've stitched around the entire neckline. I do notice one little error I have, which is a good little teaching moment right here. My neckline kind of tried to slip away from my bias strip. You are sewing two different shapes together, and even though the bias stretches to fit, it still may be a little tricky to match those raw edges up as you're sewing. So if something like this happens to you, I would really recommend that you go back and fix that. That's not really like oh, it'll be fine kind of thing, because this width right here, this seam allowance, is going to be the visible width of the binding as you look at the neckline. So if it's off anywhere, it's going to look off, like your binding isn't consistent all the way around. So just go back, just takes a couple seconds to fix that. So here we go. I'm just going to restitch that part. And it tends to happen more around the curviest parts of the neckline too. So just keep an eye as you're stitching. And there we go, all better. Okay, so what do we have here? All right. Okay, so let's look at our neckline here and what we've done so far. The next thing we're going to do is press the binding up and then inside, and then turn in that raw seam allowance so that we have it completely enclosed. That seam is completely enclosed. Now you may be wondering how this is different from a bias facing, which I know we've used before. In fact, last month we had a bias facing on the sleeveless Mariner top, right? So the difference is with a bias facing, you would actually clip those seam allowances and then understitch and turn the entire thing in so that you don't see that visible binding on the right side. It's like a facing that's turned into the inside of the garment and is hidden and then gets top stitched. So it's a little bit different. Bias binding is often used more as a decorative touch too. So this would be a great project to do a contrast binding with. So if you wanted to, like on this dress, I could have, called out the red or something like that and done a solid contrast bias binding, which would have looked really cute. But I also like how it looks coordinating with the fabric itself. Okay, so now next thing we're going to do is turn the whole thing to the inside and press. I like to do this in stages. So that's my 1/4 inch seam allowance there. I'm turning this in so that my new fold matches the top of the seam allowance. Okay, so final step before we stitch this on is to turn in the raw edge here so that it meets the fold we just made, and then press one more time. Now what you should be seeing is that it's a little bit longer on the inside, so your fold should be covering your seam line and then a little bit extra so that when we go to stitch it in the ditch on the next step, it will catch it with no problem. And you'll see what I mean on the next stitching step. So just go all the way around again, and if you like, you can put some pins in place now, because this is our last step before stitching. And here's where you can really see how well the bias grain curves around this neckline. And especially once you give it a little bit of steam, it lays really flat. Okay, so I've come around back to the beginning, and so the next thing we're going to do is stitch in the ditch from the right side of the neckline, right? Okay, so we're gonna turn it this way, and this is the ditch right here, our seam line. It's like a little gutter right there. We're gonna stitch in there, and it will, because it's a little longer, we've made the strip wide enough so that when we turn it in, you have a little overhang on there. You should be catching a little bit of the binding on the inside. Now, if you've ever wondered, like using store-bought pre-folded bias tape, why one side is longer than the other, it's exactly for this reason. You're going to put the longer side on the inside so that you can stitch in the ditch to finish your garment, okay? So just a little hot tip about store-bought bias bindings. I'm going to switch back to my edge stitch foot for this step. But I'm going to keep my needle aligned in the center so that I am stitching right where the blade is. I find this really helpful for stitching in the ditch too, because I can just align my blade with the ditch, keep my needle in the center, and it should be catching on the inside, which it is. So I'm going to keep stitching around this way, all the way around the neckline. So I've stitched all the way around the neckline, and I'm just going to make sure that I caught my binding on the inside all the way around, and it looks like I did. And so the final thing I'm going to do, and I do this anytime I do a bias binding, is the final step will be to give it a really good steam press, because you can see there's a little bit of rippling here. It's not laying so flat, and once you steam it, it totally will. So once again, steam is the cure-all. I like to give it a nice good steam, especially with this cotton. So see how nice and flat it is now with no ripples. And you can do the same thing from the back. But there you go. So that is your neckline binding. Okay, so let's talk about the armhole bindings. It's the exact same process that we just did for the neckline with a couple small differences. So difference number one, it's smaller, obviously. So I've done my ring just like I did for the neckline, and now I'm going to apply it to the armhole. So again, I would just find the opposite point from your little short seam. And then the biggest difference in applying is just the shape of the opening you're applying it to. If you can see the bottom of the armhole comes into a V point. So it's a little bit tricky. You just have to kind of straighten this out as you're sewing it. So kind of as you get to this point, kind of try to, instead of sewing this like a really extreme V, try to make it as straight as possible as you're sewing it. And of course, try to get rid of any of these little wrinkles as you sew. So it's almost like a pivot point where you'll have to get rid of some of that excess as you stitch around it. Okay, but other than that, we're going to do some very similar things here. The seam on the binding is going to match up to the underarm seam on the dress. Make sure your seam allowances stay open. And then your pinned point is going to match up to the shoulder seam of the dress. And then any excess will just get eased into the binding. So you'll stretch the binding slightly as you apply it. So that's pretty much it. Let's start sewing at the underarm. And again, just using your 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now I'm doing all of my pressing steps just the same way we did with the neckline. Okay, so we have finished the armhole binding, and this is what it looks like. So we have a finished bound neckline and armholes, and the only thing left to do is your hem. And I'm pleased to report that the hem is super easy on this dress because there's not a lot of flare to the skirt. So you can really just finish your edge, press it up, and top stitch. So I've started the process already by serging my raw edge and then turning up the hem allowance and pressing it 5/8 of an inch. And now I'm going to go to the machine and I'm going to stitch all the way around using a 1/2 inch seam allowance, stitching from the right side. Okay, everyone, so I have just finished my hem and I was giving it a final press, and believe it or not, we have a finished cobbler dress. I'm so excited about this project, and I really hope that you've loved all the skills that you've learned this month, especially our little educational journey about bias and bias binding. I hope you found that really useful. I also hope you loved the little fancy extras we did on this project, like that ruffle and how to do this pocket that's set into that princess seam. So I hope you had as much fun with this pattern as we had coming up with it here in the studio. And I hope you just go crazy making a lot of different cobbler sets. There are a lot of different, trim and color blocking opportunities. So do check out the Crowdcast this month because I have a lot of fun inspiration images to share with you. So thank you all so much for being patrons. It means the world that you support us here, and I will see you next time. Goodbye. Okay, everyone, welcome back. We just finished the main video on the cobbler dress, and I wanted to give you a few little tips and tricks on some of the processes for the pant. So let's just look at this adorable pant together. Here is what it looks like, your silhouette. I love this feature where you have a sort of flat front and it looks like a tailored pant with darts. And then secret back waistband is elastic for comfort. So these would be great, just like the original cobbler sets of the 50s for doing housework, for lounging around the house, etc. But you could also just easily dress these up. These would be so cute in like a black fabric worn with little ballet flats and a top. So lots of options here with this cute little waistband. And then we also wanted to give you some versatility at the hem. So it is a capri length, but you have a couple options. See how it's a little side slit at the bottom here at the outseam with top stitching. So instead of adding this cuff on here, you could just hem it there and just have a plain hem with the side slit, right? But we love this option, inspired by a 50s pattern, of course, to have a cuff with a tie. So you get a little knot sort of feature at your outseam on your capri pant. And this is actually a functional tie. And what I'm going to show you how to sew today are the parts of the pant that I feel like are less intuitive and also that we haven't done here before, because we've done pants a few times here on Patreon together. So I have gotten myself through the main steps of the pant, and I'm going to show you the waistband, inserting the elastic into the waistband, and also how to do that cute little tie cuff. All right, so let me show you where I am with my little engineer stripe denim. I have sewn my front darts, and I've sewn each pant leg at the inseam and outseam, and then I sewed them together at the crotch, right sides together. So unlike Lucille or Loretta or something like that, you don't have to worry about leaving room for a zipper because, again, secret elastic waistband in the back. So you just sew the entire crotch seam, no stabilizer, no interfacing yet, and you have to be careful on the outseam that you stop stitching at the circle mark, which is 2 inches above the hem. Okay, so that's going to be your slit opening. All right, so I've gotten myself to this point, and now we're going to talk about the waistband. Okay, so let's talk about how this waistband goes together. So I have both pieces here on the ironing board. My front waistband, which is the only piece in this entire pattern, dress included, that has interfacing. So make sure you've applied your interfacing to the front waistband. And then your back waistband, these are both rectangles, obviously. The back is gonna look really long, right? Because the elastic has to stretch far enough for you to get it over your hips, right? So that's why this piece is so long, because the waistline needs to be able to expand that much that it can be a pull-on pant. So we have that back piece, and now we're going to sew them right sides together at the side seams. So these short ends right here. So just sewing this into a ring. And apologies in advance for any noise. I think it's Wednesday today, right? And this is when people have a party outside of our studio, which apparently we're never invited to, but it happens every Wednesday. So that's what you might hear. Okay, I'm going to sew this at 5/8 of an inch. And now we have a few pressing steps to do with this waistband. So first things first, we're going to press open the seams we just stitched. Next thing we're going to do is fold the waistband in half lengthwise with the wrong sides together, just like this. And this step is just to crease the waistband. You ever see that in instructions? It says fold to crease. And usually what that means is that you're pressing just to create a crease that you are then going to open out but use for later reference, essentially. So we're folding just to crease right now. But this crease mark that we're creating will eventually become the top of our waistband. So it's just a reference point for later. All right, the next thing we need to do is press in the seam allowance on one of these long edges, okay? So 5/8 of an inch on one edge all the way around. Okay, so now that we've done all of those pressing steps, we are going to sew the waistband to the pant. So you're going to match the side that you did not fold in with the top of the pant. So there are notches to match to the center front of the pant, that seam right there. There are notches that match the darts and the side seams. So you can just pin all the way around. Make sure your side seams match. Make sure your darts are pressed towards center front. And on the back, you just have one notch, and that matches the center back seam. And I'm just going to throw a few more pins in between. And now we're ready to stitch around the entire waistline, sewing the waistband to the pant. Okay, so what's going to happen next is we're going to grade our seam allowances along the waistline. So you can trim the pant seam allowance, so it's the shorter one, and then the waistband should be slightly taller. So go all the way around, cutting them 2 different lengths like that. Okay, so I've finished grading my seam allowances, and now I'm going to press the seam allowances towards the waistband. And you want to be careful here that you retain your crease that we made in the last step, right? Because we want to be able to fold it there again as a reference. So I try not to press too far past the seam allowances here. Okay, when you're done pressing the seam allowances up, the next thing you're going to do is refold on your crease. And you can pin the waistband in place. The next thing we're going to do is stitch in the ditch. So you may recall this from doing your bindings on the top and or dress. So what we're looking for here is the waistband to slightly cover your seam line, right? Which it should, which mine is. So that when we stitch it from the front, we catch the waistband in our stitching so that we don't have to hand stitch this. Now, the big thing to know about this step is that we need to leave openings at the side seams to thread the elastic through in the next step. So here is what's going to happen. We're going to stitch from the right side, but at the side seams, is this the side seam? No, that's not even the side seam. So find your side seams, and then I would recommend giving yourself some double pins or something to remind yourself where to stop stitching. So I'm going to start my stitching here. I'm going to go to the next side seam, and I'm going to do another double pin here, another double pin here, a little X to remind myself to stop, and then I will finish at the first double pin that I put, okay? So what you're doing is leaving 2 openings in your stitch in the ditch, 1 at each side seam. And that's going to allow us to go from the inside and thread that elastic in there, okay? So not a huge deal if you forget to do it. You can go and open it up, but a lot easier to give yourself those markers the first time. All right, so I'm going to start about here. And your opening should be about 2 inches. I did like 1 inch on either side of my opening, but it doesn't have to be an exact science here. I'm going to use my beloved edge stitch foot here. I really like this for stitch in the ditch too, as I mentioned earlier in the dress video. So using my edge stitch foot here, I'm going to start 1 inch past that side seam. Align my blade of the foot with the seam line. And stitching in the ditch can feel a little scary with something like this. I like to keep using my right hand to feel underneath the layers and make sure that I can feel the fold extending past the seam line. And then I also kind of check my work as I go to make sure that I am catching what I need to be catching in my stitching. . Okay, so you can see that I now have a nice stitch in the ditched waistband with 2 openings at one at each side seam. Okay, so we have done our waistband and now we're ready to insert the elastic into the back waistband. So you're going to cut a length of elastic according to the chart in the instructions for your size, and you're going to put a pin, a safety pin on one end, and we're going to start to feed it through one of your openings, and we're feeding it through the back waistband only. So what I would do on this end is safety pin the end of the elastic in place here so it doesn't go flying through, which can be very annoying because it happened to me several times while I was making those pants. So do that securely. And we're just gonna feed this elastic through. Okay, so once you have pulled the elastic all the way through the casing, you are going to pull it about 5/8 of an inch past the side seam on the waistband. And then do this with extreme caution because you do not want to lose the end of the elastic and have to go digging for it. So 5/8 of an inch here, and then tuck it into the waistband. And this is really important. You want to put a nice strong pin right here on the side seam. And then we're going to stitch in the ditch right here to secure the elastic inside the waistband. And we're going to do this on both sides. But let's start with this one. Don't take your pin out until you are certain you got that needle down in that elastic and your presser foot down. And I would recommend going back and forth a few times because you really don't want your elastic to go snapping and flying out, especially when you're wearing your pants. So really secure that in place. All right, so same thing on the other side where you, first started threading the elastic through and you have that safety pin at the end. So we're just going to do the same thing on this side. Pull out enough elastic so that you feel comfortable taking the pin out. And then you can kind of tuck it back in there, making sure it extends just about 5/8 or a seam allowance past the side seam. Then you are going to put a pin in there. And same thing, just secure it by stitching in the ditch at the side seam. You can also do that stitching in the ditch from the right side if you're worried about those seams not aligning and your stitching showing on the right side. Okay, so final thing we need to do on our glorious little waistband here, well, second to final thing is we can rearrange those gathers, and now we're going to close those openings where we left the opening for the elastic by just stitching in the ditch to close them. Okay, so our elastic waistband is done, and next thing we're going to do is our tie cuffs. So let's talk about how to do this tie cuff. First thing we need to do is to top stitch the slit on each outseam. All right, so I've already pressed in the seam allowances at the slit opening, and now I'm just going to kind of pin them in place, and now we're going to top stitch this at 1/2 inch all the way around. And then we're going to pivot at the top here. So you're creating sort of a rectangular shape with the top stitching. Okay, so this will hold your seam allowances in place at the slit opening. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is, obviously you're going to do that on the other side, on the other leg as well. And the next thing we're going to do is focus on the tie cuff pieces. So you should have cut 4 of these, so 2 pairs, 2 for each side. And I cut mine on the bias just for a little visual interest with the stripes. You may notice that I did a couple different directions with the stripe on this pant. Had the stripe going vertically on the legs, horizontally on the waistband to sort of differentiate the two. And then on the cuff, it can look really cute to do a little bias moment so that you have another direction on your stripes just for visual interest. So that's why I did it that way. So what I want you to notice about this pattern piece when we put these right sides together is that one of these long ends has a set of 2 notches, a notch on each end here, and the other is completely unnotched, okay? So we need to put these together, and we are going to stitch around the tie cuff, starting at 1 notch, pivoting at this corner, going all the way around the unnotched edge, pivot at the other corner, and then you're going to finish at the opposite notch. And you may see where this is going. This is where it gets sewn to the pant leg, and this creates the tie, those ends right there. All right, let's get to it. Okay, so let's look at trimming the seam allowances in the corners. One thing that's really important though is you want to clip to your seam line at the notch right there. Okay, so do that on both sides where you have a notch. And now we're just going to trim down our seam allowances between about 1/8 and 1/4 here, all the way around. And make sure you remove any extra bulk from that point. Now we can turn this right side out. So you're gonna need to probably get some sort of tool. Let me see if I can do it without one. But like a knitting needle or something like that, or a point presser where you can turn these ends out. So you're gonna work on that. May be able to do it. I always like the challenge of seeing if I can do it without something. Being able to just dig in there with your fingernails, if you have them, and pulling that point out. So I'm going to work on this. I'm going to turn both sides right side out, pull those points out so that they're nice and crisp, and then we'll press this flat. All right, so I've turned my corners right side out. I did struggle a little with this fabric. It's a thicker fabric, and on my thinner ones, it was a little easier to get nice crisp points. But moving on, the next step is to understitch this section right here between the notches on the edge, so you have a nice crisp lower edge here. So we're going to open out the cuff like this, and we're going to make sure the seam allowances are oriented towards the side we're going to be stitching on. And it doesn't really matter which side you stitch on, like it did for the ruffle earlier, if you remember that part of the dress video, because these are interchangeable. You can place them on either side. And just stitch as far as you can until you get to the tie. And now we're going to press the whole thing flat. And here's my understitching here. I'm just going to kind of roll it out towards the edge. And at the tie end, you just want to kind of wiggle those edges out so you have a nice crisp edge there too. And there we go. And now this is ready to be sewn to the pant itself. So grab your pants, and we're going to sew the side without the understitching to the pant leg. So I'm going to do the side that I've already done the top stitching on my slit. And now what's going to happen here is we're going to open out the tie cuff, right? So you're only working with one layer, and you're going to match the finished edge of the slit with the raw edge here of the seam allowances on the tie. And we are going to pin these together. Same thing on this end. The finished edge of the slit matches the raw edge of the seam allowance where we clipped in. And now we're going to sew these together. Okay, so now that you have stitched the cuff to the pant, you can grade those seam allowances, and the pant will be the shorter one. Cuff is a little bit taller. All right, we're almost there. This step is kind of nice to do on a ham, just to have it like a raised surface here. So we're going to press these seam allowances toward the cuff itself, all the way around. And then what's going to happen is that we are going to press this seam, the free seam allowance up, and then tuck in the seam allowance, the free seam allowance. And you want to kind of roll it under so that it's just covering the seam line that we just stitched, because again, we're going to stitch in the ditch. So you want to make sure that you have a little bit of excess peeking past there. This is a like kind of annoying little area to work in because it's so closed. Just pin that in, press that in place. Okay, so now I'm going to just pin from the right side to make sure that that free seam allowance is going to stay where I pressed it. And then we're going to stitch in the ditch, and then that's pretty much it for these pants. So that's nice. There we go. Okay, so we are now going to stitch in the ditch right here, making sure that that seam allowance in the back is getting caught in our stitching. We've done a lot of stitch in the ditch on this project, and if you don't like hand stitching, you're probably very happy about that because it's reduced, actually eliminated completely any hand stitching we would do on this project. And this is a nice little like ready-wear technique. You know, this is the way that things would be done industrially, so that you're not sitting there, you know, in a garment factory hand stitching your hem. Okay, so now just trim your threads, and believe it or not, your cuff is done now. Okay, so with that, your pant is finished, or at least the tie cuff on this side is finished. Obviously, I'm going to repeat it on the other side. But to wear it, you would just tie this in a cute little knot, double it, and you've got a cute little feature on your outseam there. So really fun little design feature that we borrowed from a 50s pattern, and I hope you love it. And I hope you love this whole project, and especially getting to see the ins and outs of some of the more complicated parts of putting these pants together. But as I hope you can see, they're pretty quick and easy projects. So I hope you love making these pants, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye.